In this lesson, we will look at global ecosystems, also called biomes. There are 10 major biomes in the world, and you can see them on this map. You can see that they form broad east to west bands around the world parallel to the lines of latitude. So the plants and animals living in an area will depend on how hot or cold it is, or how wet or dry it is. So these biomes reflect the climatic belts found from the equator outward to the poles. So you will remember from your work on the global atmospheric circulation that air at the equator is hot and wet. And this is because the sun is really intense here, heats the land, heats the air above it, the warm air rises and any moisture in it condenses to rain. So here we have your tropical rainforests of South America, your rainforests of Central Africa around Congo, and your rainforests of Southeast Asia in Indonesia and Malaysia. Moving further north and south, the air is still hot because the sun is intense, but it's a lot drier because the air is falling, and so you don't get condensation. So this is where you get your deserts, about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. The Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Mojave Desert in southwest USA, your Namibian and Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, and your central Australian desert. Moving polewards even further, the climate begins to cool off, and because air is rising once again, it's wet and cool climate. And this is where we get the deciduous forests. So this is where we live, cool and wet climate of deciduous forests. Move polewards again, the climate becomes colder as the sun is less intense and much drier because the air once again is falling. So the deciduous forest gives way to this belt of coniferous forest, which gives way to tundra in the north. So you can see the biomes are reflecting these broad climatic belts going around the world. However, there are some interruptions due to other factors, and we'll have a look at those in a minute. So distance from the equator, or latitude, is the most important factor deciding what biome exists where in the world. So the sun is most intense at the equator, getting more diffuse, more spread out towards the poles. So the hotter part of the world are going to be nearest to the equator. However, there are other things that come into play. The difference in air pressure caused by the rising and falling air in the global atmospheric circulation causes winds to blow from areas of high to low pressure. And the direction the wind blows from will influence the climate. So let's have a look at the UK. It's a bit of a roundabout. The winds from the feral and the polar cells converge or meet over the UK and bring us the variety of weather that we experience. If the wind is blowing from the north, the weather is cool, and if it's blowing from the south, it's much warmer. If the wind blows from the west over the sea, it is wet, and if it blows from the continent, from the east, it's much drier. So this means that different parts of the UK have slightly different climates, and different plants and animals will be found naturally in different parts of the country. Ocean currents are drawn by the movement of air from the high to low pressure in the global atmospheric circulation, and they will influence our climate. So have a look at the map. You will see that deciduous forest is found a lot further north in northwest Europe than the equivalent latitude in North America. And this is because we have a warm ocean current coming from the Gulf Stream, keeping us much warmer in winter in northwest Europe than the equivalent latitude in North America. Altitude, or height above sea level, will also influence climate. As you go up a hill, the temperature decreases, which is why it's really important to always take warm clothes with you if you're climbing a mountain. But you know this also just by looking at a mountain. When you go out and you look up a mountain, you can see there's a point where the trees stop growing because above this point it's too cold. The other way altitude affects climate is by forcing air to rise, which then cools, condenses, and we get relief rain on the one side of the mountain. The descending air on the other side of the mountain is much drier and is called the rain shadow. And you can see this effect on the map. If you look at Central Asia here, north of the Himalayas is a rain shadow. You get the Tibetan Plateau, which is very dry, and this is where you get the cold deserts of the world, the Gobi Desert in Mongolia and China. These areas are very dry because the winds have released their rain on the south side of the plateau, the south side of the Himalayas, leaving the Central Asian area in the rain shadow. So to recap, the tropical rainforests are found near the equator in Central and South America, parts of Africa and Asia. They're hot and humid and contain a huge variety of plants and animals, around half of all the world's species, a great biodiversity. The trees are mostly hardwood, that means not conifers, and the climate is called equatorial. Then slightly further north and slightly further south, you have the savanna grasslands or the tropical grasslands. These are hot and dry and they're dominated by grass, scrub and occasional trees. They have two distinct seasons, a dry season where much of the vegetation dries back and a rainy season where it grows rapidly. This is where you get the big game, the elephants and the lions and the tigers. They are found in Central Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Tanzania and Northern Australia and Central South America like Venezuela and Brazil. Then as the climate gets even drier, you get your deserts, the driest and hottest of areas. The world's largest desert is the Sahara in North Africa, and then the areas of scrub land that border the desert are called desert scrub. So just to remind ourselves why we find tropical rainforests at the equator. The sun here is really intense, heats the land, which heats the air. Warm air rises, water in it condenses, causing rain. And that is why we have this wonderful lush forest teeming with plants and animals at the equatorial rain belt, otherwise known as the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone. This air then begins to fall, and about 30 degrees south and 30 degrees north of the equator. And because no condensation is happening, these areas are really dry, giving us our deserts. The air is then drawn back into the equator where it's reheated. Now, we talked about an area between the desert and between the rainforests called the savanna. So it is still hot, but it's not as dry as the deserts, but it's not as wet as the rainforest. And the savanna has a rainy season. Now, this rain belt, because the earth is slightly tilted, will move slightly towards the summer. So if it's summer in the northern hemisphere, this rain belt shifts north. If it's summer in the southern hemisphere, this rain belt shifts south to where the sun is most intense. So that is why the savanna experiences summer rain as this rain belt shifts over it. So the final three biomes that we're going to look at in detail are the coniferous forest, the tundra, and then the temperate deciduous forest. So first of all, let's start from the south. The temperate deciduous forest is where we live. They contain trees that lose their leaves in winter. They are found across Europe and the USA. Now, the distinct weather is it's mild and wet, and the climate is called temperate maritime because it's influenced by wet wind coming off the sea. Further north, where it's a bit colder, you have the coniferous forests, the trees that do not lose their leaves in winter, the evergreen trees, and they're found in broad bands across northern Canada, Russia, Scandinavia. They have a cool climate with a moderate rainfall, and they're called cool temperate climates. And then in the north, up towards the Arctic Circle, you have tundra. They have extremely cold climates with a limited number of plants and animals able to survive there. A lot of the animals actually live in the sea because it's too cold on the land. It's cold because the sun is very diffuse there, especially in the winter you have complete darkness, and it is dry because the air is descending here.